Thank you very much and welcome everyone today. It's great to have you here and to have the opportunity to talk to you today about one of the most important questions that has faced mankind throughout our history, which is the question of hatred, why people hate. I want to take you back first to my first beginnings of interest in this topic, which was back in 1998 when I first went to Istanbul, which is a city that I love, amazing city. And I was reading at the time the history of Byzantium, the history of the early centuries after Christ of the Roman Empire in Istanbul, or Byzantium as it was known then, and this incredible hatred that emerged, not between religions, not between races, not between families, but between two chariot racing teams who were known as the Greens and the Blues. And this hatred continued for centuries, and it was something that was almost impossible to explain. It was something that divided the city, first amongst 4 different racing teams, but then it narrowed down to 2. Hatred seems to work well when there's only 2 parties involved. So the Greens and the Blues were constantly fighting in the streets. People would be murdered. There were assassinations, and eventually it all came to a climax in 532 AD under the rule of the Emperor Justinian, when a massacre was finally carried out by the Blues with the assistance of the imperial forces, who chose the Blues as the party that they would support. And 30,000 people were killed in the Hippodrome in Istanbul, which you can still see today on the edge of the Sea of Marmara. And this kind of hatred is so difficult for us to explain today. Procopius, the great historian of this period, simply could not explain what it was that drove people to support the Blues or the Greens and to hate their other team with the sort of fury that could divide families, that could go beyond, as he said, relationship, beyond friendship, beyond brothers or kin. And he said, I, for my part, am unable to call this anything but a disease of the soul. And so it's this disease of the soul that I want to talk about today, and how it might be that we, as different researchers, as historians, as social scientists, as anthropologists, as neurologists, as scientists of different backgrounds, might be able to come together to start to bring insights into this question that we've never had before. In 1994, many people may even remember in their own lifetimes the experience of seeing in the newspaper, reading these accounts of the killing in Rwanda. Another incredible example of hatred in which something between 800,000 and 1 million people were slaughtered in the streets, men, women and children slaughtered in the course of just 100 days. And many researchers now trying to come to terms, Rwandans themselves, other Africans, people all over the world trying to come to terms with what it was that drove what was largely the Hutu-dominated government to slaughter their fellow Rwandans, who they identified as Tutsi. We've seen it ourselves in our own streets. Only in the last few years, attacks upon Indian students for reasons that we find so difficult to explain in a society in which we praise the values of tolerance, we praise cosmopolitanism, we praise friendship and love, and yet hatred can erupt. Hatred that targets people, that makes them feel afraid, makes them feel insecure for their very lives. And only earlier this year, I went to a conference in Boston And I was walking around the streets of Boston. You know, this is a city with an extraordinary and very proud history. And then only 2 weeks later, after my return to Australia, just a few metres away from the restaurant where we had our conference dinner, the Boston Marathon bombing took place, which again threw these questions of hate really into the forefront of people's questioning. Why would it be that young men brought up in a society would turn their hatred on their fellow citizens in this way? So these are really the questions that stand in front of us. And I think that it's time for us to bring together our insights on hatred. Historians have investigated many of these events, historians of different stripes in different areas, historians of Byzantine Greece, historians of contemporary Africa, historians of contemporary Australia, historians, social scientists investigating terrorism, social psychologists, the famous Milgram experiment, which looked at the role that obedience played in some of the experiences of World War II, for example, to try to explain why it would be that men and women too would accept to kill their own fellow citizens, in some instances their own neighbours. And all we've seen in the period since are other examples, whether on a social scale or whether on a neighbourhood scale, of these kinds of acts of hatred. Scientists, for their part, have made considerable strides into understanding the way in which the human brain works, and have brought us back to thinking about the human brain as the origin of these kinds of emotions, these strong emotions. They have certainly investigated such questions as fear, such questions as love and intimacy. What kinds of parts of the brain are activated when different emotions occur in a human being? When we stimulate an emotion, what part of the brain is working? Is it possible that there are certain circuits within the brain that are associated with particular emotional states? Is there a form of activation, or indeed a form of deactivation, a form of calming that goes with certain familiar emotional states? And this kind of question, I think, is really crucial and very, very exciting for historians and social scientists who want to understand something about the way hate works. But many of the scientific explanations so far, the scientific studies that have been carried out by neurologists, have looked at what we call interpersonal hate, hatred of people that you know. One study asked the subjects to bring along a picture of a person they hated. I'm sure we can all think of at least one person who we felt that emotion about at some time in our life. And for most of us, that person will be someone that we know, someone that we knew, someone who played a role in our lives. And so when people, when the subjects of these experiments focused on these images, their brain activity was mapped, and it was shown that in most instances, it was similar kinds of areas of the brain that were involved in intimacy and in love. And I think that makes sense, particularly because it's those sorts of people that the subjects had chosen for as their kind of object of hate. But what does it mean in these other instances of hate which involve people that we don't know, people who we have never met, abstract categories of people that we feel hatred towards? And I think it's in this regard that some recent scholars of hate, some of the most advanced studies, have proposed what they've called a duplex theory of hate. A theory of hate that's based on emotion, but emotion in a more complex relationship, emotions that triangulate. And this is a theory that applies equally to love and to hate. The version of triangulation in the nature of love is between intimacy, passion, and commitment. And there are different types of love that may involve one or more of those emotions in different ways and in different balances. And this helps to explain the different kinds of love, whether it's maternal love, whether it is selfless love of one's fellows, whether it is that kind of passionate love, on occasion whether it's the kind of obsessive love that leads to stalking, and which can lead to forms of hatred, where love and hate become indistinguishable from one another. So social psychologists such as Robert Sternberg have proposed that a similar kind of triangulation relates to the nature of hate, that it's the inversion of these emotions, disgust in place of intimacy, devaluation in place of commitment, anger or fear as negative emotions in the place of that kind of passion that comes out of oneself towards the other. But alongside this triangulation of emotions, the duplex theory of hate also suggests that there are stories that we tell, that stories are very, very important. We all know the importance of love stories. We see love stories around us hundreds of times a day in advertisements, in songs, in Hollywood movies, in all forms of popular culture. But in a similar kind of a way, stories of hate can also be powerful. Perhaps they are not as public, perhaps they are not as overt, but many people, and certainly when they get together in groups, perhaps meeting in a pub or after school discussions off somewhere in their own space where they talk amongst those with whom they're intimate, that they will often exchange these kinds of stories and reinforce these kinds of stories, and that people will feel more comfortable perhaps because of these stories. So, what is it then that we can do to start thinking further about hate? The first question I think that we have to ask ourselves is whether hate is always a bad emotion. Is all hate bad? Or, as William Hazlitt said, is hate something that spices up our lives? Is it something that we need in order to feel a passion towards something, that we need to hate something else? We often use the word hate in a very commonplace manner to say, I hate chocolate or I hate vanilla. But this sense of love and hate is part of our sense of what a passionate commitment in the world might mean. So is it then a question of how we channel that hate, whether we turn it to a destructive object or whether we turn it, for example, in the hatred towards injustice, we turn it to a noble object? These are the kinds of questions that face us. But with those negative forms of distrust, what is it that we can do as scientists of various stripes, as scholars, as historians? How can we bring our insights together in order to find the best way forward and to illuminate a much larger form of study that might either try to channel or try to reduce those feelings of hate that poison our lives and that could contribute to something like the hatred of the chariot races, the Greens and the Blues, the kind of destruction in Rwanda, attacks on innocent people in our streets, whether those are our own students or whether they are innocent people running in a marathon. So it's this that I would welcome all of my colleagues to bring their insights as much as we possibly can to try to bring together some new sense of what hate is and how we can best deal with it as a society. Thank you very much.